Hey, it's Rupin. I'm the Conscious Parenting Coach. You can follow me on my socials and look me up on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. I'd really love to connect, so make sure you do reach out. Today, what I'm going to be specifically talking about is the evolutionary process that human beings have had to go through so that they can start to use the cognition that is required to make conscious decisions in the moment, and how we've got to this point so far. What we have to remember is that prehistoric, before we were able to really think, before we were able to read and write, make notes, before we were able to communicate with each other, there was ancient versions of the human being that we understand today. And you might have heard of Homo erectus. There's we're Homo sapiens, like there's Homo erectus that comes right before us. Apparently there's a missing link that goes between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. But before Homo erectus, there's just chimpanzees and stuff, and there's lots of different brackets between monkeys and humans that we must have evolved through. But before monkeys, there was just a more general mammal. We were a more general, different, non-evolved version of a monkey, and we probably share a lot of genetic history with other mammals. And then beyond when we evolved into mammals, you have to think that maybe we just shared a lot of DNA with all different types of animal species, all of the different parts of the kingdom. And so before mammal, what did we share our DNA with in our ancestral biology and anatomy? And there's a time before mammals where we also share our anatomy with lizards. So it goes back really far, probably dinosaur age or something like that. There's probably some lizards that survived, and then they split off, and some mammals and some lizards. But essentially there's different parts of our evolutionary progression that you can track back, and if they're the same in two different species groups, then that means that they must have evolved apart at some point. So what we kind of can use from this information is we can look at the ways in which our cognition helps us to make conscious decisions. And when we dip in and out of our consciousness, and when we don't make conscious decisions, we can remember that we actually share a lot of genetic makeup with some previous versions of ourselves. And the fight and flight response and also the freeze response are the ways in which many people react to their difficult and surprising circumstances. So if they're ever thrown into anxiety, if they're ever thrown into a situation where they might need to make an instantaneous reaction, and they are unable to make a conscious effort to think this through, to decide what the best possible way to deal with the situation is, and to use our verbal reasoning to come to a compromise or collaborative effort to decide what is the right thing to do, we might end up in a different part of our brain, and that part of our brain is going to give us a less evolved version of the decision-making process. One of the decisions that we are very aware of, that we hear about a lot, is this fight or flight. And what I would like you to visualize is that our brain is all part of our central nervous system. There isn't a brain and the central nervous system being separate. I'd just like you to think about the brain as it is part of the central nervous system, and that the central nervous system is part of the brain. There's no end of the nerves, it's just all nerves. The whole thing is nerves. And so the spinal column is all nerves as well. So the brain and the spinal column, and then all the nerves that branch out to the different limbs, are all connected, and they're all part of the brain, and they're all part of the nervous system. Our brains are most evolved at the front. We have the cognitive parts, the linguistic parts, the memory parts. So all of the most powerful computational parts of our brain are all at the front, and this is because our brains have evolved forward. So as we've evolved, we've started at the back of the brain and we've evolved forwards, and we can see that in the skull formation of different previous versions of what humans used to be. And sometimes in sci-fi you see these aliens with massive foreheads, and they've kind of got a head that leans forwards, and that's because they're imagining what the next level of the evolution might be, is to grow your brain forwards and pick up new skills that we haven't developed yet because we just haven't evolved them yet. So with the brain growing forwards and evolving forwards, we can track it backwards, and we can look back at where the less evolved versions of ourselves would have had their brain end. So where would have been the top of their brain? And when we think about going back as far as mammals, when they were four-legged creatures, they might have a lot of mammals walk on their front and hind legs. This was something that human beings split off from the rest of the mammals to be upright standing creatures, which was fundamental for our development because it gave us our hands free, but it sacrificed the child rearing potential or something like this. We had to sacrifice something about child rearing and pregnancy, because when we're standing upright we benefited a lot, but we also were a bit more exposed. We didn't have the load bearing four-legged that perhaps like a cow you can imagine can carry quite a lot of weight, but it's something that we've kind of evolved away from, and as we have evolved away from it, it's allowed us to carry our head and our brain and to allow our brain to grow. So when we were previously on our backs, when we were perhaps even like lying down on the floor, maybe we were like ocean dwelling creatures, we would have had a brain that was closer to the spinal column, that we would have had less of a developed brain, and so it would be more like just having a spinal column. And animals that don't have heads, like a worm or something like that, that just has a brain, its entire brain is just in its nervous system. So that's where we started, and as we've grown out of certain responses. So the response that I really want to talk about first is the fight or flight response. Now, we will have experienced times when we've gone into fight or flight, and I often use this example that we picked up from Mark. He runs this course called Master Your Anxiety, and he's a really good friend of mine on Instagram. You can check him out and sign up for his course if that's what you fancy. He helps people who are dealing with anxiety, and he references a saber-toothed tiger, that back in the day it was really important for your ancestors to survive saber-toothed tigers. So they have a fight or flight response that worked, and you know that you had solid ancestors who all survived because you're here. So you are the product of many people whose fight or flight responses worked at the time that it needed to, and that they survived all the situations where they could have died. So the fact that you're here is proof that whatever they did worked. So you will still carry that within you, and you still carry this fight or flight, and you feel the fight or flight response come to you, especially at times when you feel triggered or you feel under attack. You will decide whether it's the right decision to run or whether it's the right decision to fight. However, we are trying to live in a civilized society which doesn't require you to utilize your fight or flight response. Actually, what's beneficial is that when we recognize that we are in our fight or flight response, and that we start to move up the spinal column and start to use our more upstairs brain, and that we say to ourselves, we're not under attack right now. This person might be scary, this person might be much bigger than me, this person might be aggressive and trying to attack me, but actually I'm not face to face with a saber-toothed tiger right now, so my verbal reasoning might be enough. And this is not for cases where you're being abused or in a dangerous situation, life-threatening. In those situations, possibly flight would be the right situation, and we would like to trust our fight or flight response. Lots of the time we can trust our flight or flight response, and we're grateful to have it. It's a really beautiful part of our human existence. But on occasion, when it's the wrong decision, when it's not healthy, we need to understand that we have this part of our brain that resides in our spinal column that doesn't allow us to have the cognition. We don't get a chance to think it through when we're in fight or flight. So we have to recognize it, and we have to pick it up really early so that we can start to use our more cognitive upstairs brain, and we can start to send the decision making, that we can start to make more healthy, communicative, mature, collaborative decisions. That's what I would like to make. That's what I would like to say. So the fight or flight response is our mammalian brain. Like, that's what all mammals, they hold this fight or flight response. Like I mentioned about cows, you can kind of imagine that a herd of cows, they don't really think like, is this something that I can reason with? They decide whether they should run or whether they should front. And if they should front, they might attack, but if they're not going to attack, they just run. It's like they don't have lots of in-betweens because they don't have the cognition, they don't have that brain. And then even earlier in our survival, we have the freeze response, because of predators who don't see unless their prey is moving, and that they can see their prey very well when it's moving. So we have this freeze response that is well depicted. You know, Medusa, the mythology, she had snakes for her hair, and when she looked at somebody they would freeze and they would turn to stone. So this is like being caught. The basilisk in Harry Potter, when the person looks in its eyes, they freeze and they turn to stone. It's like this common method of, this common reaction to fear is to freeze. And when we're in our freeze response, we can know that we're even lower down the spinal column. Like, we're right down at the bottom, down on the evolutionary spinal column, right back to the lizard time, when we were the same as species fork as lizards, and then we fork away and we start to become mammals, and lizards maintain this freeze response to danger. So we can kind of see where we've peeled off from these different parts of the species, different parts of the animal kingdom. So we can use this to understand like how ancient this part of our brain is, and in knowing how ancient this part of our brain is, we can choose not to engage with it. We can choose not to be a victim to our ancient responses, and we can start to make those healthy, educated, conscious, communicative, verbal, thoughtful, collaborative, effortful decisions, and ones that we come to with good reasoning and logic, and we start to use all the parts of our brain to make these decisions. Now, if you're a parent and sometimes you go into fight or flight response, that is the wrong space for you to be in. Like, if you are dealing with your child, I understand that some parents get scared because their children might be 15 or 16, and they might be capable of causing some damage, and some children can be quite destructive. So I'm not saying that in all cases it's inappropriate to be in a fight or flight response, but I'm talking generally, like when a parent is having an argument with their child, if they're going into fight or flight response, it means that they are in their anxiety and that they're not able to soothe themselves to enter their cognitive brain, to enter their upstairs brain. So I'd really love to teach you how to do that. I think what I'll do is I'll pause here, and what we'll do is we'll do another video which will be the guided meditation of how to relax your fight or flight response and how to enter a more cognitive, verbal, reasoning part of your brain. So really love to see you in part 2 of the video. Make sure you check it out. It'll be in one of the links just here, and please drop a comment and let us know what you thought of today's video. I'm so pleased that you're here today. Really lovely to chat to you, and I can't wait to hear from you soon. See you in part 2. Bye.